What if the most terrifying part of death isn't the ending, but the possibility that ending is a story your brain tells because it has no other way to file the unknown? What if the universe doesn't run like a silent machine that accidentally grew minds as a side effect, but something closer to the opposite? Mind is the condition that makes a universe show up at all. That sounds like philosophy. It sounds like midnight talk, half poetry, half coping. But the uncomfortable truth is that modern science has been tripping over the same problem for more than a century, and it's not going away. The observer. Not the observer as a person with beliefs, but the observer as the fact that measurement, knowing, keeps appearing in the rules that govern reality at its smallest scales. Before we go anywhere near big claims, we're going to do something more honest. We'll build a careful bridge between what we experience, what physics actually says, and what a controversial theory called bioentrism tries to do with that gap. No promises, no magical certainty, just a guided walk through one of the strangest corners of modern thinking, with a rule that matters. We treat this as a working theory, not a guaranteed truth. Because death as a reset button is a powerful idea. It can be comforting, it can be addictive, it can also be nonsense. The only way to stay credible is to hold it gently and test what it actually explains. Start with something simple and intimate. Sleep. Every night you disappear. Kind of. You shut your eyes, your body stays in the world, but your experience changes in a way that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has never dreamed. In a dream, you can be in a city you've never visited. You can talk to people who don't exist. You can feel fear, love, relief, panic, full-body emotions without anything in the room changing at all. Your brain takes minimal input and generates an entire reality that feels, in the moment, like the only reality there is. When you wake up, that world collapses, not because it was fake in a childish sense, but because it wasn't independent. It depended on a particular state of your mind. Change the state, and the world changes with it. That's not a mystical claim, it's a daily fact. And it points to something we usually ignore. Your experience of reality is always constructed. Even right now, awake, you are not directly tasting the universe as it is. You're receiving signals, photons, vibrations, pressure, chemicals, and your brain is building a model, a usable story. A survival-friendly interface. Color is the easiest example. Red feels like a property of the rose, but what exists out there is electromagnetic radiation in a certain range. The redness is your experience, your nervous system translating a wavelength into a sensation. The world provides input, your mind provides meaning. The reality you live inside is a partnership between both. Now imagine extending that logic beyond color. What if distance is also partly an experience? What if time, this unstoppable river you feel carrying you forward, is not a universal external thing, but a framework your mind uses to order change? That's where the conversation starts getting dangerous, because it threatens the most basic assumptions we use to keep ourselves calm. And that's exactly why it's interesting. The mainstream story is clean and brutal. Consciousness is produced by the brain. The brain is matter. Matter follows laws. So consciousness is a late byproduct, an emergent glow that appears when matter gets complex enough. In that story, death is simple. The glow ends. The brain stops. Experience stops. Everything continues without you. A lot of smart people accept that story. It has evidence behind it. Change the brain and the mind changes. Damage certain regions and memory collapses. Change neurochemistry and consciousness shifts. Anesthesia can switch experience off like a light. Those are not small points. Any theory that pretends neuroscience doesn't matter is not serious. So what is bioentrism? And why do people even mention it? Bioentrism is associated with Robert Lanza, a physician and researcher in regenerative medicine, who argued for a reversal of the usual hierarchy. Life and consciousness are not accidents inside a pre-existing universe. Instead, the universe as we understand it, especially space and time, cannot be separated from the fact that living observers perceive it. In other words, consciousness isn't simply produced by the brain the way heat is produced by friction. Consciousness is part of the foundation. That's a wild claim, and it's disputed. But it's not random. It's a reaction to a specific crack in the physical worldview, one that shows up whenever you ask what quantum mechanics is actually describing. Quantum mechanics is not fringe science. It's the engine beneath the modern world. If you are reading this on a screen, quantum rules are already doing work inside the device. The problem is that quantum mechanics is unbelievably precise at predicting outcomes, but deeply confusing when you ask what those outcomes mean. At the quantum level, the universe doesn't behave like a set of solid objects with fixed properties. It behaves like a set of probabilities that become definite only when something counts as a measurement. Before measurement, a system is described by a wave function, an object that encodes what could happen. After measurement, you get one outcome, a fact, a single result in a world that now looks classical and stable. The debate starts right there. What causes the shift from could to is? Some interpretations say it's just physical interaction, no mind required. Others say the observer is unavoidable in the formalism. Many physicists choose to treat the math as a tool and avoid deep claims about reality. That's not cowardice. It's a practical survival tactic in a field where the equations are perfect and the meaning is a knife fight. Bioentrism enters the knife fight with a bold move. It takes the observer seriously. Not in a cartoon way, not your thoughts create money, but in a technical sense. Reality as experienced, the world of objects located in space, unfolding in time, might be inseparable from conscious observation because space and time might not be fundamental containers. They might be ways living systems organize experience. Here's why that idea doesn't die instantly. The most famous experiment in quantum physics makes the observer problem impossible to ignore. You've heard of it, even if you've never studied physics. The double-slit experiment. Imagine you fire particles, electrons for example, toward a barrier with two slits, and you record where they land on a screen behind it. If electrons are tiny bullets, you expect two clusters, one for the left slit and one for the right. But what you get when you don't track which slit each electron passes through is an interference pattern, a pattern that screams wave. Alternating bands where electrons land more or less often, as if waves are overlapping and cancelling each other out. It gets stranger. Even if you fire electrons one at a time, so there is never more than one electron in the setup, the interference pattern still builds up over time. Each electron hits the screen at a single point, but the overall distribution forms a wave-like pattern, as if each electron went through both slits as a spread-out possibility, then chose a single landing point when it was detected. Then you add detectors to learn which slit each electron uses, and the interference pattern disappears. You get the two clusters again. Same apparatus, same particles, same room. Different result depending on whether path information becomes available. This is the part where people start reaching for comforting extremes. One extreme says, consciousness creates reality, therefore my mind can do anything. That's not physics. That's a motivational poster dressed as science. The other extreme says, no consciousness needed, measurement is just atoms colliding with atoms. That's closer to the mainstream vibe, but it still leaves questions hanging. Because if everything is quantum, then the measuring device is also quantum. If you follow the equations all the way up, you get an endless chain of entanglement and no clear point where a single outcome becomes definite for anyone. Some interpretations avoid collapse entirely by saying every outcome happens in branching worlds. Some propose spontaneous collapse mechanisms. Some propose hidden variable models. The point isn't that bioentrism wins. The point is that the observer problem is real, and any serious worldview has to deal with it. Bioentrism's claim is that the world you live in, the classical world of definite things, arises through observation because observation is not passive. Measurement doesn't just reveal a fact. In quantum mechanics, measurement helps create the fact. Now, hold that carefully. This doesn't mean your personal thoughts rewrite the universe like an author editing a script. It means the distinction between out there and in here may be less absolute than the story we inherited. And that leads us back to sleep again, because sleep is where you can feel, directly, how reality depends on the mind's organizing power. In dreams, your brain builds space, it builds time, it builds causal stories, it generates characters with motives. It even generates a you inside the dream, an identity riding through a world that feels external. Then you wake up, and the dream world vanishes. Not because it never happened as experience, but because the framework supporting it changed. Bioentrism suggests that waking life is not as different from that as we assume. Not that it's imaginary, but that it is structured. That space and time might be part of the structuring, not eternal containers that exist independent of observers. Einstein already weakened the old idea of time. In relativity, time isn't a universal ticking metronome. It depends on motion and gravity. Two observers can disagree about durations and still both be right. There is no single cosmic now that the universe shares. That alone is enough to make your everyday intuition about time feel suspicious. And if time is not absolute, then the story we tell ourselves about death, a future where I don't exist, starts to look like a particular perspective inside a particular framework, not necessarily the final truth about what existence is. This is where people get emotional, fast. Because death isn't just an idea, it's the deepest background noise of being alive. Even when you're not thinking about it, it shapes how you love, how you plan, how you fear losing people, how you imagine your own absence. The mind tries to picture not being, and it fails, because picturing is still a form of being. So when a theory shows up whispering that death might not be what you think, it grabs attention. It feels like oxygen. But attention is not evidence. If we want to learn from the best creators in this niche, we keep the hook sharp while staying disciplined. Here's the disciplined version of the promise bioentrism dangles. If consciousness is fundamental, and if space and time are frameworks tied to perception, then death may be less like a hard shutdown and more like a boundary where one mode of experience ends. The body can stop, the brain can stop, but the question, does awareness stop, becomes less settled than materialism assumes. Critics will immediately respond, that's unfalsifiable, that's metaphysics. And that criticism matters. A theory that can't be tested can't be treated like a proven fact. Bioentrism is often described, even by sympathetic people, as an interpretation rather than a predictive physical theory. It may be insightful, it may be wrong, it may be a stepping stone. But it forces one uncomfortable question into the light. Why is consciousness here at all? And why does physics keep making room for the observer? You don't have to accept bioentrism to feel the force of that question. You just have to be honest about the mystery. The mainstream story says you are matter that learned to think. Bioentrism suggests you are thinking that makes matter meaningful in the first place. The difference between those two stories is not just intellectual. It changes what life feels like from the inside. One story makes consciousness a temporary glitch in a cold system. The other makes consciousness part of the system's foundation. And now we're at the point where the video either becomes a lecture or it becomes a ride. So let's make it a ride without lying. Take a simple moment. You're alone at night, half asleep, watching the ceiling. The world is quiet. Your thoughts drift. In that liminal state, you can feel how reality is not a solid block, but a shifting relationship between attention and experience. The room doesn't change, but your sense of it changes. Time stretches, memories become vivid, futures feel heavy. Your brain is doing what brains do, building a world. Now zoom outward. The universe itself, at the deepest level we can measure, also behaves as if it isn't fully decided until measurement happens. As if the world is not a completed painting hanging in space, but something more like a process that resolves into facts when observation draws a line through possibility. That is the crack. And once you see it, you start noticing other cracks, places where the clean, comforting story of a purely objective world begins to look like a useful approximation rather than the final map of reality. Your brain is not a camera, it's a prediction machine wearing a camera costume. Right now, even as you sit perfectly still, your nervous system is doing something insanely active. It's guessing what's out there, then using incoming signals to correct the guess. Vision isn't light goes in, picture comes out. Vision is your brain saying, based on everything I've learned, the most likely world right now is this, and then constantly updating that model as new photons arrive. That's why illusions work, not because you're dumb, because your brain is doing what it was built to do, compress chaos into something usable. If a shadow could be a snake, your ancestors who jumped first and analyzed later got to have descendants. The brain's job was never to show you objective reality. The brain's job was to keep you alive inside a reality that changes faster than you can think. And sleep is the clearest proof that reality and experience are not the same thing. Because in a dream, your brain generates space, time, characters, emotion, plot, danger, sometimes with zero external input that would justify it. Your body is lying still. Your room is the same, but your mind drops you into a world that feels external while you're inside it. Then you wake up, and that world doesn't just end, it evaporates as if it was never a place at all. Here's the part people underestimate. Dreaming isn't a weird glitch, it's a demonstration. It's your brain showing you, every single night, that it can build a convincing universe from the inside out. It can manufacture a there, a before, a after, a me, and a them. It can even manufacture meaning. So when a theory like bioentrism says, space and time might not be fundamental containers, it's not starting from fantasy. It's starting from an uncomfortable observation. The only reality you ever directly touch is the reality you experience. Everything else is inference. Every measurement, every reading, every photograph, every scientific graph eventually becomes a moment in a mind. Now be careful here. This is the exact spot where people slip into nonsense. They hear the mind constructs experience and leap to the mind creates the universe. That leap is not automatic. It needs support. It needs a reason. It needs something sturdier than vibes. And the reason the conversation even exists is because physics, hard, cold, unforgiving physics, has a scar that never healed: the measurement problem. Quantum mechanics predicts outcomes with ridiculous precision, but it describes reality in a way that doesn't match human intuition. At the smallest scales, systems don't always have definite properties until measurement happens. That doesn't mean we don't know yet. It means the theory itself treats definiteness as something that appears when a measurement occurs. So what is a measurement? The lazy answer is any interaction with a device. But then you run into a trap, because devices are made of atoms, and atoms are quantum. So if everything is quantum, why does the device produce a single definite outcome instead of becoming part of the same fog of possibilities? Why does could turn into is at some point? Where is the line between the quantum world of possibilities and the classical world of facts? Physicists have names for the ways we try to patch this. Decoherence is one of them, an account of how quantum systems become entangled with their environments so that interference effects effectively vanish. Decoherence explains why quantum weirdness is hard to observe at large scales. It explains why the world looks classical most of the time. But here's the crucial point. Decoherence doesn't magically produce one outcome for an experiencer. It explains why options stop interfering, not why a particular option becomes the one you live through. The "why this result" question can still sit there, refusing to leave. That's where interpretations explode into the room. Some say, there is no collapse, every outcome happens in branching worlds. Some say, collapse is a real physical process. Some say, collapse happens when a system becomes classical enough, though defining that boundary is a headache. Some choose not to commit and treat quantum mechanics as a calculator. Bioentrism picks a side. It treats observation, not just interaction, but the availability of information to a conscious perspective as essential. Not because it wants to be mystical, but because the observer keeps showing up like an unwanted character in the script. And this is where the science of sleep sits in the background like a quiet threat to certainty. Because consciousness itself is still not explained. We can map brain activity. We can correlate patterns with perception. We can watch regions light up when you recognize a face or feel fear. We can turn consciousness down with anesthesia and watch the brain's large-scale coordination change. We can damage a region and remove a piece of experience like it was a feature toggle. This is real evidence, and it matters. It strongly suggests the brain is deeply involved in shaping what you experience. But notice what none of that answers. Why is there an experience at all? You can describe a symphony as vibrating air, pressure waves, hair cells in the ear, electrical signals, neural firing patterns. You can describe the full mechanism. But the description still doesn't contain the thing you actually care about. What it feels like to hear the symphony, the warmth, the shiver, the sadness, the beauty. That first-person there-ness of experience is the hard part. The part science can correlate, but not yet explain in a complete way. So we end up with two broad stories people tell, even if they don't realize they're choosing a story. Story 1. The brain generates consciousness the way a furnace generates heat. Complex matter produces mind as an emergent property. When the brain ends, consciousness ends. Clean, brutal, intuitive. Story 2. The brain shapes, filters, or tunes consciousness the way a radio tunes a signal. The brain is still crucial. Damage it, and the output changes. But the brain is not the ultimate origin of awareness. When the brain ends, the local tuning ends, but the deeper thing might not. Bioentrism leans towards story 2 because it wants consciousness to be fundamental rather than accidental. But it's not enough to want that. The entire credibility of the video depends on treating it as a hypothesis with arguments, not a promise with mood lighting. So let's ground it again in something undeniable. Your experience of reality depends on states of consciousness. In deep sleep, the world doesn't go away, but your access to it does. In dreams, a world appears that isn't anchored to the room. Under anesthesia, time can vanish. One moment you're counting down, the next moment hours are gone with no experience in between. Your brain didn't record the passage of time as lived experience. For you, it didn't happen. That doesn't mean physics changed. It means the reality you live inside is inseparable from the state of awareness you're in. Now imagine applying that idea to the deepest level of physics, where definite reality seems to depend on measurement. That's the temptation bioentrism can't resist. Maybe measurement is not just physical disturbance. Maybe measurement is the moment possibility becomes experience, and experience is where reality cashes out. But again, careful. This is not your thoughts can bend spoons. This is a narrower, stranger claim, that the world as facts is tied to observation in a way our everyday intuition doesn't capture. That the universe, at the foundation, may be less like a finished object and more like a process that resolves into definite outcomes when observation draws a boundary through possibility. If that is even partly true, then two terrifying questions start to wobble. First, what exactly is an observer? Second, what happens when an observer stops observing? This is why death gets pulled into the conversation. Not because bioentrism offers a clean afterlife story. Honestly, it doesn't. But because if consciousness is not just a late byproduct of matter, then the simple materialist conclusion about death becomes less final than it looks from the outside. Not disproven, not defeated, just less settled. And that's enough to hold attention, because the human brain is allergic to unresolved endings. We can tolerate pain. We can tolerate uncertainty about money, relationships, even identity. But the idea of a hard stop, an absolute never again, hits a deeper nerve. So here's the plan, and we're going to keep it tight and honest. In the next stretch, we'll walk through the experiment that made the observer impossible to ignore, even for people who hate philosophy. The double-slit experiment. Not in a textbook way, in a story way. Step by step, so you can feel where intuition breaks and why. Then we'll go one level deeper into the stuff that feels like it should be illegal. Delayed choice experiments and the quantum eraser. Results that make it look like the present can reshape what counts as the past, at least in the structure of what becomes a fact. And once you see those pieces clearly, bioentrism stops sounding like a random thought and starts sounding like what it really is. A risky interpretation trying to stitch together three mysteries that refuse to stay separate: quantum measurement, the nature of time, and the existence of conscious experience. No hype needed. The weirdness is already real. There is a moment every night when the world proves a brutal point. You close your eyes, you fall into deep sleep, and for you, reality is gone. Not the universe, not the room, not the laws of physics. Those may continue. But your experienced reality, the only reality you ever actually live inside, shuts off like a screen. No color, no distance, no time passing, no self-narrating. Just a blank you cannot even remember. Then, hours later, you return, and your mind stitches continuity back together so smoothly you rarely notice the gap. The clock says time passed, but you did not have that time. You did not witness it. You did not inhabit it. You simply reappeared in the next available moment of awareness. Bioentrism begins right there, in that crack between the world and your experience of the world. It does not start by saying, the universe is inside your head. That would be a cheap trick. It starts by saying something more careful and far more unsettling. The reality you can ever confirm is reality as it appears in consciousness. And that is not an opinion. It is a constraint. Every measurement, every instrument reading, every image from a telescope, every number on a screen only becomes a fact for someone when it enters awareness. Physics can describe patterns in the world with breathtaking accuracy, but the bridge from pattern to experience still runs through the observer. Robert Lanza organized bioentrism into principles, but the first one is the keystone. If you remove it, the whole structure collapses. The first principle says that what we call reality is a process that involves consciousness. And it adds a claim that sounds impossible until you look closely at your own perception. Space and time are not things out there the way we intuitively assume. They are tools the mind uses to organize experience. Start with something simple: color. You look at a red object and you feel like redness is a property of the object itself. But what is actually happening is electromagnetic radiation hits your eyes, your nervous system converts it into signals, and the experience of red appears in awareness. The wavelength exists as a physical description, but redness is not floating in the air. It is a felt quality inside consciousness. We do not see the world as it is. We see the world as our brains can represent it. Now scale that up. Depth, distance, the space between you and the wall. You feel it as obvious, as objective, as if space is a container and objects are placed inside it. But your sense of depth is constructed from cues, slight differences between the images in your two eyes, motion parallax when you move your head, relative size and shading, perspective lines. Your brain takes these signals and generates a 3D model. That model is incredibly useful, but it is still a model. Babies do not pop out perceiving depth the way adults do. The brain learns how to build space. Time works the same way. You feel it flowing, you feel it dragging, you feel it racing, you feel it slicing your life into before and after. But your experience of time is braided with attention and memory. When you are bored, your brain marks more moments and time seems slow. When you are absorbed, your brain compresses the record and time seems fast. In dreams, you can live through a full story in what appears to be minutes. Under anesthesia, you can lose hours as if they never existed. The river of time you feel is not a direct sense like sight or touch. It is a construction the mind uses to order change. None of this proves the universe depends on you. It proves something more precise. The universe you experience is inseparable from the machinery of experiencing. The mind is not a passive window, it is an active organizer. And that matters because at the deepest level of physics, what exists behaves as if it is also organized by observation. Here is the classic objection people raise, and it sounds reasonable until you stare at it long enough. They say, fine, perception is indirect, but there is still a world out there. The tree exists even if no one looks at it. Common sense loves this sentence because it feels like the adult thing to say. But bioentrism asks a ruthless question. What exactly does it mean to claim the tree exists unobserved? You cannot observe an unobserved tree. The moment you check, you become part of the story. You can place a camera, sure, but a camera is not awareness. It is a device that changes state when photons hit it. That change becomes information only when a conscious observer reads it. The camera does not experience the tree, it stores patterns. Experience happens elsewhere. This sounds like philosophy, but it has teeth because quantum mechanics forces the same kind of question onto physics. At the quantum level, systems are described by a wave function, a mathematical object that encodes probabilities. And what is haunting is this. The wave function does not always represent a hidden, definite reality we simply do not know yet. In the standard formalism, definite outcomes appear when measurements happen. Before measurement, the theory describes possibilities, not facts. So the question becomes unavoidable. What is a measurement? Is it any physical interaction at all, like atoms bumping into atoms? Or is it something closer to the moment information becomes available as a definite outcome in experience? Physicists have argued about this for a century because the math works perfectly while the meaning stays slippery. Bioentrism's first principle takes a stand. It says, space and time are the mind's way of arranging experience, and the solid world of facts is what emerges when consciousness resolves possibility into an experienced outcome. It is not saying you personally control reality with your wishes. It is not saying the universe obeys your ego. It is saying the observer is not an optional extra. Observation is part of the mechanism by which reality becomes the kind of reality we can talk about at all. To feel how radical this is, you have to look at your own life from a strange angle. Think of the past. You feel like the past is a place that existed and is now gone. But you never touch the past directly. You only ever have memories in the present. You only ever have records in the present. Fossils, light from distant galaxies, old photographs, brain states, written notes. All of it is present data that your mind organizes into a story called history. The past is real as a model that explains present evidence, but it is not something you can step into without being in the present again. The same is true of the future. You feel the future like a looming space in front of you, filled with events that have not happened yet. But you never touch the future directly either. You have expectations in the present, simulations in the present, plans in the present. The future is a projection, a prediction, a story the mind uses to guide action. Time, for you, is not a hallway you walk down. It is the mind's ordering of experience into a sequence. This is where sleep science becomes more than a fun aside. Sleep shows you that consciousness is not a steady beam. It is a mode that turns on and off. It also shows you that the mind can generate an entire world with internal consistency, including space and time, without relying on the external environment in the way you assume during waking life. Dreams are not proof that the waking world is unreal. They are proof that world and experience are not the same category. Your mind can build space. Your mind can build time. Your mind can build a self that feels continuous. Bioentrism takes that and says, maybe waking space and waking time are also constructions, just far more stable because they are constrained by shared rules and shared observations. The world is not made up. It is structured. It is consistent. It resists your wishes. But the form in which it appears, the way it is partitioned into here and there, now and then, object and background, may be inseparable from the observer's framework. This is also where people get nervous, because it sounds like you are stepping towards solipsism, the idea that only your mind exists. Bioentrism does not need that. In fact, solipsism is too small and too human. The claim is not, my mind makes everything. The claim is, consciousness is fundamental, meaning observation is not an accident at the edge of the universe. It is part of what the universe is. Many observers, many points of view, a shared reality emerging from the interplay of observation and the patterns that remain consistent across observers. Now, the first principle creates a domino effect. If space and time are not objective containers, then some questions we ask about the universe may be built on shaky assumptions. For example, when we say the universe is billions of years old, that statement is derived from present observations and models. It is powerful, it is predictive, it is supported by evidence, but it is still a story the present tells based on present data. Bioentrism doesn't have to deny the evidence. It questions what before observers even means if time itself is an observer-dependent framework. And then there is the fine-tuning puzzle, which is often misunderstood. Physicists have noted that certain constants appear to sit in ranges that allow complex structures to exist. If those ranges were drastically different, chemistry and stable matter might not exist in the same way. People jump from this to mystical conclusions. Bioentrism offers a different interpretation. If observation is woven into reality, then it is less surprising that the reality we experience is compatible with observers. That is not proof of design. It is an attempt to connect why this kind of universe to the fact that any described universe is always a universe from within experience. But bioentrism cannot survive on philosophy alone. It needs a laboratory anchor, something that forces the observer into the story even when you try to keep it out. And that anchor is the experiment that keeps humiliating common sense, the double-slit experiment. Because the double-slit is not about opinions, it is not about spirituality. It is about what happens when you shoot particles through two openings and simply ask a basic question. Did the particle go through the left slit or the right slit? When you try to find out, reality behaves one way. When you do not, it behaves another way. And the most unsettling part is that nothing in the setup looks like it should care about your knowing. No human hands reaching into the apparatus, no magic. Just the presence or absence of information about the path. Yet the pattern changes, as if the universe is allergic to being forced into a definite story before observation demands it. So the first principle is not a soft claim like everything is consciousness. It is a hard reframing. Reality as we know it is inseparable from the observer's framework of space and time, and quantum physics seems to echo that inseparability at the most fundamental level. Now we are ready for the moment where the theory stops sounding like a clever idea and starts feeling like a trapdoor. Because once you see the double slit clearly, you can no longer pretend the observer is irrelevant. The question becomes what bioentrism dares to ask next. If observation helps shape the world of facts, what exactly is the observer, and how deep does that relationship go? Picture a dark lab at 2 a.m., the kind of place where the air feels still and the only sound is a machine clicking like a metronome for reality. A beam source, a barrier, two thin cuts in metal, a screen that records tiny impacts. That is it. No cathedral, no ritual, just a simple setup that looks too ordinary to be dangerous. And yet, this one experiment has made generations of physicists stare at the ceiling at night, wondering whether the universe has been playing a deeper game the whole time. Richard Feynman famously treated this experiment like the nerve center of quantum mechanics. Not because it is complicated, but because it is clean. It strips away your assumptions until only the weirdness remains. If you can understand what is happening here, you understand why the observer keeps haunting physics like a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. Start with the simplest version. Imagine you have a wall with a single narrow slit cut into it. On one side you fire particles, electrons, photons, it does not matter. On the other side is a detection screen that records where each particle lands. If you fire a lot of particles through one slit, you get a familiar spread. Most hits land behind the slit. Fewer hits land farther out, like a soft hill of impacts. That makes sense. A narrow opening causes spreading, nothing mystical. Now open a second slit. Two slits, two openings. Common sense says you should get two hills on the screen, one behind each slit, because each particle should go through one slit or the other, like tiny bullets. But that is not what you see. Instead, you get stripes. Bright bands where many particles land, dark bands where almost none land. An interference pattern, a fingerprint of waves. Waves do that. When waves overlap, they add and cancel. Peaks reinforce peaks, peaks cancel troughs, and the result is a pattern of strong and weak regions. That is what water does. That is what sound does. That is what light does when you treat it as a wave. Here is where the trapdoor opens. Because you are not firing a continuous wave, you can turn the source down so far that only one particle travels through the setup at a time. One electron, one photon. Nothing else in the apparatus with it. No crowd, no swarm, just a single traveler. And still, if you let enough of these single particles pass one by one, the interference pattern builds up anyway. Each particle arrives as a dot, a single, localized impact. It hits the screen at a definite point like a particle. But the overall pattern formed by many impacts looks like a wave interfered with itself. As if each particle somehow went through both slits, in the sense that its probability spread covered both paths, and those possibilities interfered. This is not a cute metaphor. The mathematics of quantum mechanics describes a wave function, and the wave function evolves like a wave. With two slits open, the wave function includes two paths, and the math predicts interference. Then the screen registers one outcome, one dot, like a particle. Wave-like evolution, particle-like result. That split personality is the whole drama. So the obvious question becomes unavoidable. Which slit did the particle actually go through? If you are a human being with a human brain, your instinct is to demand a definite history. It went left, it went right. Reality must pick. A particle cannot be in two places at once. That is the classical instinct. That is the instinct that makes the universe feel stable. So physicists tried to catch the particle in the act. They placed a detector near the slits, not a person watching with their eyes, a device, something that can register which slit the particle passes through. The goal is simple. Keep both slits open, but mark the path, left or right. Then you should see two hills, because now you know the history. And that is exactly what happens. The interference pattern disappears. The stripes fade. The screen shows the two-hill pattern you expected in the first place. Same apparatus, same particles, same distance, same screen. The only difference is that the system now contains which path information. That phrase is the center of the puzzle. Which path information? Not a human stared at it. Not someone believed hard enough. Information. Once the path is knowable, even in principle, the interference pattern vanishes. If you've never sat with this, it is easy to underestimate how offensive it is to common sense. We are used to thinking that measurement reveals what is already there. Classical physics is built on that idea. You can look at a planet through a telescope, and the telescope does not change the orbit. You can measure a table, and your ruler does not alter the table into a different kind of object. Measurement is passive. Quantum measurement is not passive. In the standard framework, measurement is an interaction that produces a definite outcome, and that outcome is what we call a fact. Before that, the theory describes probabilities. It does not describe a tiny hidden bullet traveling a single path that you simply failed to notice. It describes a spread of possibilities that behave like a wave. So why does knowing the path matter? Here is where you have to be careful, because this is exactly where people start exaggerating and turning physics into fortune cookies. The clean, mainstream statement goes like this. Interference requires coherence, meaning the different paths must remain phase-related, like parts of a single wave. When you install a detector that can distinguish the paths, the particle becomes entangled with the detector and the environment. The system now carries path information. The two possibilities stop behaving like one coherent wave, and the interference fades. This is tied to something called decoherence. The spread of quantum possibilities becomes effectively scrambled when it leaks information into the environment. No magic, no human mind required, at least in this description. Just physics. Interaction, entanglement, lost coherence. That is the standard story many physicists are comfortable with. It is also honest. You do not need to claim that consciousness collapses reality to describe what the experiment does. But here is the reason this still doesn't let you sleep peacefully. Decoherence explains why interference becomes unobservable in practice. It explains why macroscopic objects do not behave like giant waves. It explains why the world looks classical most of the time. But it does not fully settle what a definite outcome actually is. It tells you why the quantum weirdness becomes hidden, but it leaves the deepest question intact. Why do we ever experience one outcome rather than a superposition of outcomes? You can push the quantum description outward. Describe the particle quantum mechanically. Then, describe the detector quantum mechanically. Then describe the lab quantum mechanically. Then the air molecules. Then the Earth. Then the photons leaving the lab. The chain spreads. In the pure math, the universe becomes one entangled wave function evolving smoothly. So where does the single dot on the screen become a single dot for someone? Where does one history become the history you live in? This is the measurement problem, and it is not a fringe issue. It is the reason quantum mechanics has multiple interpretations that all predict the same experimental results but tell very different stories about reality. One interpretation says the wave function truly collapses during measurement, and the collapse is a real physical process. Another says there is no collapse. All outcomes happen, and you only experience one branch. Another says hidden variables guide the outcomes underneath, even if we cannot access them. Another says the wave function is not reality at all, only a tool for predicting what observers will see. The math works, the meaning is contested. Bioentrism steps into that contested space and makes a provocative move. It says, look at what keeps returning in the story. The observer. Not as a metaphor, not as a motivational poster. The observer as the one place where information becomes experience. The observer as the point where the world stops being a cloud of possibilities and becomes a lived fact. In the bioentric framing, the double-slit result is not just about particles being disturbed by detectors. It is about how reality as experienced is not independent of observation. A detector that records which path information is, in a deep sense, building a bridge toward a definite narrative, left or right, within the system. The interference pattern is the signature of a world that has not been forced into a single story. The two-hill pattern is the signature of a world that has been forced to commit. And you can test how brutal this commitment is with variations that feel like the universe is messing with time. There are delayed choice versions, where the decision to measure which path is made after the particle has already passed the slits. Classical instinct says it should be too late. The particle already went through something. History should be locked in. But quantum experiments show the pattern depends on whether path information exists, even if the choice to reveal it happens later in the setup. The clean takeaway is not "we changed the past" like a sci-fi movie. The clean takeaway is the quantum description does not assign a classical history until measurement makes that history meaningful. So what does that imply? If you are a strict materialist, you can say, nothing spooky. The particle's wave function evolves, entangles, decoheres, and the interference disappears because the environment carries which path info. End of story. If you are honest, you admit, that still leaves the single outcome experience unaccounted for at the deepest level. Why this dot and not another? Why this branch and not the others? Why does the universe present itself to experience as a definite world at all? Bioentrism answers, because consciousness is not a late add-on. It is not a byproduct that appears after matter is already fully real. Consciousness is part of the mechanism by which the world becomes the kind of world that can be experienced. The observer is not a camera. The observer is the condition under which information becomes reality for someone. And this is where the experiment stops being only about particles. It becomes personal, in a quiet, unsettling way. Because you are not just watching quantum mechanics from the outside. You are an observer, built out of the same universe the experiment is probing. You are the very phenomenon the theory refuses to treat as an afterthought. Most people live as if the world is a finished product and consciousness is just along for the ride. The double-slit experiment is one of the few places where nature hints with a straight face that the relationship may run deeper. Not proven, not settled, but deep enough that the most advanced physics we have cannot fully remove the observer from the story. And once you really absorb that, you start to see why bioentrism dares to say what it says next. If the observer is woven into the structure of what becomes definite, then space and time might not be the hard containers we imagine. They might be part of the mind's framework for turning raw reality into experience. And if that is true, the scariest assumption we carry, death ends the observer, stops being a simple biological fact and becomes a deeper question. Because the real terror is not the body failing. The real terror is the idea that the movie ends, the screen goes black forever, and there is no one left to witness anything at all. Bioentrism is not claiming to have an easy answer, but the double-slit experiment is the moment it earns the right to ask the question without sounding like pure fantasy. The universe behaves one way when which path information is impossible, and another way when which path information exists. It is as if reality refuses to commit until it must. That is the weirdness. That is the hook. And that is why, from here, the conversation can no longer be only about particles and screens. It has to become about time, memory, and the deepest boundary we all pretend we understand. Time feels like the one thing you can trust. Even if everything else is confusing, time feels obvious. You were a child, then you weren't. A minute ago, you hadn't read this sentence, and now you have. The clock keeps moving. Your body gets older. Days vanish like coins dropped into a deep well. And if death scares people, it's not just the idea of pain or loss. It's the idea of a future where you're simply not there. A world that continues without you, with sunsets and conversations and rainstorms happening in a timeline you will never enter again. But here's the problem. Physics does not treat time the way your nervous system does, and your nervous system is basically a storytelling machine with a heartbeat. It stitches sensations into a now. It labels memories as past. It projects guesses as future. And then it calls that whole internal movie reality. The double-slit experiment already hinted that reality refuses to become definite until measurement forces it to commit. Now time steps forward and does something even more unsettling. It refuses to behave like a single, universal river. Relativity cracks the first illusion. People talk about Einstein like he proved time is relative as a fun fact, like a trivia card. But the real implication is darker and stranger. There is no master clock, no cosmic now that every creature in the universe shares. Two observers moving differently can disagree about what events are simultaneous. Two observers sitting at different gravitational heights can disagree about how fast time passes. GPS literally has to correct for this, or your phone would start lying to you by kilometers. Time is not a background stage. It's part of the structure, and the structure changes depending on your frame of reference. That already kills the comforting story we carry around, that the universe runs on one objective timeline, and we are passengers. If physics is right, you don't live inside time the way a fish lives inside water. You live inside your own local slice of space-time, and what you call now is not a universal moment. It's a perspective. And if now is not universal, what exactly is the past? Your brain treats the past as a place, like a hallway behind you. You can't go back, but it's there. You feel that yesterday is gone, but real. You feel that 10 years ago is distant, but solid. Yet you never actually experience the past. You experience memories, present brain states that represent prior events. When you remember a birthday, you are not visiting a time portal. You are generating a simulation right now. You're reassembling fragments, a face, a smell, a room, the emotion you think you felt. And neuroscience has shown how fragile that is. Memory isn't a perfect recording, it's reconstruction. Each time you remember, you're also rewriting. So the past you carry is not a fixed archive. It is a living story updated by the present. That's not mysticism. That's a biological fact. And it matters because it means your sense of time is already partially inside out. The past isn't a place you access. It's a model you build. Now bring quantum physics back into the room, because quantum experiments have a nasty habit of punishing any story that tries to be too tidy. There are versions of the double-slit setup, delayed choice experiments, where the decision to reveal which path information is made only after the particle has already passed the point where, in a classical story, it must have chosen a path. The outcome still depends on whether the information exists. The cleanest interpretation is not that we're sending signals into the past like a sci-fi gun. The cleanest interpretation is that the universe does not assign a classical history until measurement makes that history meaningful. History, in that view, is not a frozen tape. It is something that becomes definite when the conditions for definiteness exist. And if you let that idea breathe for more than 5 seconds, it messes with everything. Because your deepest fear is based on a timeline assumption, that the future is real in the same way the present is real, and that you will eventually be missing from it. But what is the future except prediction? The future, for you, is an internal simulation made out of patterns. It's your brain running probability models. Your body is a prediction engine. It predicts where your foot will land, predicts whether a sound is a threat, predicts what someone means by their tone. The thing you call future is your prediction engine aimed forward. It feels like a place because the brain makes it feel that way. But that doesn't prove it exists as a place. It proves you can imagine it. This is where the science of sleep becomes a perfect mirror. Every night, your sense of time gets turned off and turned back on like a light switch, and you barely notice how weird that is. Think about deep sleep. Not the cozy, I'm drifting phase. Deep, slow-wave sleep. You close your eyes and there's a jump cut. No passage. No minutes ticking by inside experience. One moment you're awake, then nothing. Then suddenly, you're waking up and the clock has traveled without you. You didn't experience those hours. You infer them. You look at the time. You feel your body. You reconstruct the gap. Dreaming is even stranger. In a dream, time can stretch or collapse. 10 seconds of real time can hold an entire dream narrative that feels like a journey. Or hours can vanish into a single scene. Your brain is clearly capable of generating time as a texture of experience, not merely reading time like a ruler. It can speed it up, slow it down, bend it, glitch it. And it does this every night, as if reminding you, hey, your sense of time is a feature, not a law. Now add anesthesia into the picture, not as a spooky claim, just as a blunt medical reality. Under general anesthesia, the brain's normal integration of experience shuts down. And from the patient's point of view, it is often another jump cut. No passage, no I felt time moving. Just off, then on. The world continues, the body continues, the clock continues, but the lived experience of time can disappear entirely. So here's the question Bioentrism wants you to hold without flinching. If your sense of time can turn off while the universe keeps going, what exactly is time in the first-person sense? It's not a river you're floating in, it's a mode your consciousness runs, a way your awareness orders events, a user interface. And user interfaces are not the underlying machine. The same goes for space, by the way, but we'll get there. For now, stay on time. If time is not fundamental in the way we imagine, if it is partly a construct, partly a framework, then the most terrifying idea about death starts to wobble. Because the terror is built on a mental image, a long timeline stretching forward with you erased from it. But erased from it is already a story told inside time perception. If you zoom out to the block universe idea that falls naturally out of relativity, the story gets even stranger. In that view, space-time is a four-dimensional structure where past, present, and future are not separate realms. They are different coordinates in one geometric object. Nothing flows in space-time itself. Flow is what consciousness experiences while moving along its world line. The movie exists as a whole. You experience it frame by frame. This is not a comforting idea at first. It sounds like fate carved in stone. It sounds like your choices are illusions. But that's not what it has to mean. Even in a block universe, your decisions are part of the structure. The reasons you choose, the emotions you feel, the uncertainty you experience, those are not outside the block. They are the block. The uncertainty is real to you because the local information available to you is limited, and physics is brutally honest about limited information. It's not a moral failing, it's the nature of being an embedded observer. What the block universe does, though, is remove the special status of now. There is no cosmic present. There is just your present, here, inside a particular frame. And that loops right back to the bioentric theme. Because bioentrism isn't just saying consciousness matters like a motivational slogan, it's saying the very categories you use, space, time, objects, may be the mind's way of organizing something deeper. The mind doesn't float on top of reality like foam on the ocean. The mind may be part of the ocean's structure. That is why this starts to sound like death is a reset button to so many people. Not because science has proven immortality, it hasn't. The honest position is still uncertainty. But the old certainty, you are a brain, your brain dies, your consciousness ends and time continues without you, is not as airtight as it once felt, because time itself is no longer airtight. And here the sleep science gives one more haunting clue. Every morning you wake up and your consciousness reboots into a world that feels continuous. You call it, "I slept." But the experience of those hours may have contained no timeline at all. You build continuity after the fact. The self that wakes is stitched to the self that fell asleep by memory, narrative, identity. You are, in a very real sense, reconstructed daily. So imagine, purely as a thought experiment, that death is not experienced as a long darkness, not as a waiting room, not as an endless empty time. Because endless empty time would still require time as an experienced dimension. And if time as experienced is a mode consciousness runs, then the most naive picture of forever nothingness starts to look like a category error, like trying to imagine color in a world where vision is turned off. That doesn't prove anything about what comes next. It doesn't promise a soul, or heaven, or reincarnation. It just forces the question into sharper focus. When you imagine non-existence, you are still imagining it inside the mental framework of time and space. Frameworks that physics already treats as observer-dependent and that biology treats as manipulable. And once you see that, you start to suspect the real mystery is not, does death end everything? The real mystery is, what is the observer, really? What is the thing that experiences a now at all? Because if reality needs observation to become definite, if the universe refuses to choose until it must, then the observer isn't a side character. The observer is part of the plot engine. So the next step isn't to make big, comforting claims. The next step is to take the most uncomfortable possibility seriously. That the categories you use to describe existence, here, there, before, after, might be the mind's interface, not the universe's foundation. And if that's true, then the question of death stops being only biological. It becomes a question about the limits of that interface, and what happens when the interface shuts down. You don't notice space the way you notice time. Time hurts you. Time leaves fingerprints. Space just feels like the default setting. The room is out there. The wall is over there. The sky is above. The stars are far. It feels so natural that questioning space sounds like you're trying to be edgy for no reason. But if Chapter 5 loosened your grip on the idea of a universal clock, Chapter 6 is where the floor creaks under the idea of a universal stage. Because here's the uncomfortable thing. You don't actually perceive space directly. You infer it. You build it. Your brain takes raw signals, light, sound timing, pressure, balance, and stitches them into a 3D world that feels continuous, stable, and external. That stitching is so good, you mistake it for reality itself. But it's a model. A brilliantly useful model. And like any model, it can be hacked, distorted, or switched off. Think about binocular vision. Your depth perception comes from tiny differences between what each eye sees, plus learned cues like perspective, blur, motion parallax. Babies don't start with a perfect 3D world. Their brains calibrate it. Your sense of near and far is a skill your nervous system learned. The space you live in is partially an achievement. Your brain even maintains an internal map. Neuroscientists discovered place cells and grid cells, neurons that fire based on where you are, like a biological GPS. When you walk through a house in the dark, you're not seeing the space, you're simulating it. That simulation is so convincing that you can navigate by it. And it can break. People with certain neurological injuries can ignore half of space entirely, as if the left side of the world doesn't exist. Not they choose to ignore it, their experience literally deletes it. That's not philosophy, that's clinical reality. If space were a purely objective container delivered to you untouched, your brain shouldn't be able to erase half of it. Now take a step sideways into illusions. The rubber hand illusion. Your real hand is hidden, a fake hand is placed in view, and both are stroked in sync. After a while, your brain adopts the fake hand as mine. You can feel ownership shift. Your body map updates. Your space updates. Virtual reality does the same thing at scale. Your eyes tell you you're on a cliff. Your balance system argues. Your heart rate spikes anyway. You're not reacting to an external cliff. You're reacting to the brain's constructed space. Again, none of this says the world is fake. It says the world you experience is mediated. Lived space is not raw space. It's interpreted space. Einstein then comes in like a wrecking ball and tells us that even physical space, the stuff physics talks about, doesn't behave like a fixed stage either. In Newton's world, space is an infinite grid. Objects move through it. End of story. Einstein's world is different. Space and time are fused into space-time, and space-time bends. Gravity is not a mysterious pull across distance. It's geometry. Mass energy tells space-time how to curve, and curved space-time tells matter how to move. That means space is not independent. It is shaped. It is dynamic. It participates. The stage responds to the actors, and even worse for our intuition, different observers disagree about distances the way they disagree about time. There is no absolute length, no absolute simultaneity. What you call far can be different from what I call far depending on how we move. Already, the naive idea of space as a single shared container begins to dissolve. Physics isn't saying space doesn't exist. Physics is saying space isn't what your instincts think it is. Then quantum mechanics shows up and makes the word location feel like a polite fiction. You learned in school that objects are somewhere. Quantum theory says, at the fundamental level, somewhere is not always a property things possess. Before measurement, a particle's position is described by a wave function, a spread of probabilities. It's not that the particle is definitely at one point, and we just don't know which. The math behaves as if the particle genuinely has no definite position until the act of measurement forces an outcome. This is the same shock from the double-slit experiment, but now it applies to the idea of place itself. And if you try to picture a probability wave spread across space, you hit a weird loop. You're using space as the backdrop for something that doesn't behave like it fully lives inside space. Entanglement pushes the knife deeper. Two particles can be entangled so that measuring one instantly constrains the other, even if they're separated by huge distances. No usable faster-than-light messages, sure, but the correlations are real and experimentally verified. The universe behaves as if the two particles are not truly independent entities separated by space, but parts of one system. Distance becomes suspiciously irrelevant. That's why Einstein called it spooky action. Not because he loved drama, but because it violates the spirit of a world built out of separate pieces located in a container called space. And here's where modern physics starts sounding like science fiction. So we need to be careful and honest. There are serious research programs suggesting that space-time might be emergent, meaning it could arise from deeper relationships like information and entanglement, rather than being fundamental. Some theoretical ideas, still debated, still not settled truth, hint that geometry could be a consequence of how quantum systems are connected. In that picture, space is not the first ingredient. Correlation is, relationship is, structure is, and space is what that structure looks like from the inside. Notice what this does to the bioentrism vibe without even mentioning bioentrism. It makes the intuitive stage and actor's story feel backwards. Maybe where things are is not the base layer. Maybe it's how our minds and our measurements translate deeper patterns into something we can navigate. So what does bioentrism do with this? It makes a bold move. It treats space like time, a framework tied to observation, not an independent container that exists fully formed without observers. The argument isn't, nothing exists unless you personally look at it. That would be solipsism, and it collapses under real life. The argument is subtler. What you call space is inseparable from the conditions of perception and measurement. Reality, as experienced and as described by physics, is entangled with the presence of observers, because observation is how possibilities become facts. You don't have to believe that as a religion. You can hold it as a working hypothesis. Maybe space is partly a mind-linked interface. Maybe distance is not a fundamental barrier, but a feature of the way information is organized in our experience. Here's the part that keeps people watching, because it starts to feel personal. If time is not a universal river, and space is not a universal stage, then the story you tell yourself about your life, "I'm a thing inside space moving through time until I stop," might be a story written by the interface, not by the underlying system. And if that's true, then death might not be what your interface imagines it to be. Not because we're promising an afterlife, not because we're selling comfort, but because the fear itself depends on a particular picture. A self localized in space, traveling forward through time, approaching a point where the movie ends and darkness continues forever. But darkness continues forever is still a time story. I am gone from the world is still a space story. If both time and space are observer-bound frameworks, then your default mental image of what ending means could be a category mistake, like trying to picture what happens to a song when the speaker breaks, as if the song falls into silence inside the room. Maybe the room was never where the song truly lived. Sleep keeps returning as a quiet, scientific warning sign. In deep sleep, your awareness of both time and space can vanish. Not fade, vanish. No inner clock, no inner room, no where, no when. And yet you don't experience that as an infinite void. You experience it as nothing at all. Then a reboot. The interface shuts down, and there is no felt duration to the shutdown. That doesn't prove anything about death, but it proves something important about experience. When the interface is off, you don't sit inside time waiting. There is no waiting. Waiting requires time perception. So now the question becomes sharper and way more dangerous in the intellectual sense. If your lived reality is constructed through an interface that produces space and time as the organizing grid, what happens when the interface shuts down permanently? Does the self end the way a thing ends inside space and time? Or does the very meaning of end depend on the interface that is shutting down? That's the cliff edge. That's the place where people either click away because it's too weird, or they lean in because it finally feels like we're touching the real nerve of the mystery. And we still haven't even talked about the self yet. Not the personality, not the memories, not the biography. The raw, I am here feeling. The fact that experience is happening at all. If bioentrism is even partly right, then consciousness isn't a passenger in space-time. It's part of what makes space-time show up as a usable world in the first place. Which would mean the deepest question isn't, where do you go after death? The deepest question is, what is an observer, really? And why does reality care that one exists? That's where we go next. Because once space starts looking like a constructed language of experience, once here and there stop feeling like absolute categories, you're ready for the most unsettling possibility of all, that your ending might not be a location in the universe. It might be a boundary in the interface. And boundaries in interfaces don't always behave like endings in reality. If you're still here, then the question has already changed shape. It's not, do I survive in the movie trailer sense? It's, what does survival even mean when the things we use to define ending space, time, location might be part of the interface. Bioentrism doesn't ask you to deny death. It asks you to stop imagining death as the simplest story we've been trained to tell, a self moving forward along a timeline inside a cosmic container until the timeline keeps going without you. That story feels obvious because it matches how our brains keep score. The brain is a prediction engine. It learns patterns, then projects them forward. Day follows night. Hunger follows time without food. Fatigue follows long wakefulness. So it predicts. If consciousness is here now, and consciousness correlates with brain activity, then when the brain activity stops, consciousness stops. That is a powerful inference. It's also an inference, not a direct observation. Nobody has ever experienced their own non-experience and come back with a measurement. The closest we get are edge states, sleep, anesthesia, blackouts, coma, where the ordinary narration of time can disappear, then restart as if no duration passed at all. You go under, you wake up. You don't experience the gap as being trapped in nothing for hours. The gap has no felt length. That's a small detail with a big shadow. It tells you the sensation of time continuing is not guaranteed. It's built, it's maintained, it's an output. Now, careful. None of this proves that something continues after death. It doesn't. If anyone sells you certainty here, they're not doing science, they're doing comfort merchandising. What bioentrism does is point at a structural weirdness in our worldview. We treat consciousness as a late product of matter. Then we act shocked when consciousness refuses to be explained purely as matter. We treat space and time as absolute. Then we discover they warp, stretch, disagree across observers, and possibly emerge from deeper relationships. We treat observation as passive. Then quantum mechanics keeps insisting observation is part of the event. Over and over, the obvious picture cracks at the seams. So here's the most honest way to hold bioentrism, as a working lens, a hypothesis about the order of explanation. Instead of matter, brain, consciousness, it suggests we might need to flip something. Consciousness, observation, structured reality, including matter, space, time. That doesn't mean your personal ego is cosmic royalty. That would be childish. It means the fact that experience happens at all might be a basic ingredient, not an accidental byproduct. When people hear that, they usually panic in one of two directions. One group goes, "So nothing is real?" The other group goes, "So I'm immortal?" Both are overreactions. The first one is nihilism wearing a lab coat. The second one is wishful thinking wearing a physics hoodie. The more interesting middle path is, reality is real, but it may be relational. It may be participatory. Not in the cheesy, manifest your destiny sense. In the precise sense that the universe we can talk about, measure, and experience is inseparable from the conditions that make measurement and experience possible. Think of it like this. You can't play a video game without a screen. The world of the game, its colors, distance, movement, exists as a structured experience on that display. Smash the screen, and the game world vanishes for you. Not because the code ceased to exist in some absolute metaphysical way, but because the interface that made it a world has stopped functioning. The mainstream materialist view says, the brain is the code, the mind is the graphics. Bioentrism hints, what if the brain is closer to the display than the code? What if consciousness is not produced by the brain, but filtered, shaped, localized by it into a human life? Again, that's not proof. It's a model that fits certain puzzles without hand-waving them away. Neuroscience can still be true in this model. Brain changes correlate with experience changes because the interface matters. Damage the interface and the channel changes. Alter the interface and the signal expresses differently. That's not controversial. The controversy is only about whether the interface creates the signal or constrains it. And right now, Science does not have a final answer. It has mountains of correlation. It has powerful theories. It does not have the because that turns correlation into a complete explanation of subjective experience. Now bring sleep back in, because sleep is the one laboratory every human visits nightly. In deep sleep, you lose the world. You lose the sense of being located somewhere. You lose the running commentary of time. In dreams, the mind builds a world from scratch. Space, characters, motion, causality, often with zero respect for physics. Yet it still feels real while you're inside it. The point isn't waking life is a dream. The point is that the mind is capable of manufacturing the structure of a world, including spatial layout and temporal flow. That means world structure is not something your consciousness merely receives. It is something consciousness can generate. Bioentrism takes that capacity and asks a radical question. What if waking reality is the stable, shared version of that world generation, constrained by consistent laws, shared across observers, but still dependent on observation as the act that turns possibility into fact? This is where the title stops being a spooky hook and becomes a serious inquiry. What if death doesn't end the way we picture it, because our picture of end is built from time and space assumptions that may not be fundamental? If the felt flow of time is a cognitive output, then the fear I will be gone for an infinite time may be built on a misunderstanding. Infinity is a time concept. After is a time concept. The world continues without me is a space and time concept. If those are interface categories, then the scariest mental image of death might be like imagining where the flame goes when the candle goes out, treating a process as if it were an object traveling somewhere. What remains when you subtract the mental movie? Not your biography, not your name, not your preferences. The most basic fact: there is awareness. The raw something is happening. Bioentrism points at that and says, maybe that is not a late-stage accident. Maybe that is the starting point. If that's true, then the biggest mistake we make is treating consciousness as a disposable spark trapped inside matter, when it may be closer to the thing that makes matter show up as a meaningful, measurable world in the first place. Now, the critics are right to keep us honest. Bioentrism is controversial. It's not the mainstream consensus. It can be attacked for being too interpretive, too broad, too hard to falsify in a clean lab test. And humility matters here. The scientific attitude isn't, I found the final answer. It's, I found a lens that explains certain things better than my old lens, and I'm going to test how far it goes before it breaks. That's the vibe you should take into this. But even if bioentrism turns out to be wrong, it exposes something real about us. We've been pretending the observer is irrelevant in a universe where observation keeps changing the story. We've been pretending consciousness is a footnote in a world where consciousness is the one thing we can't step outside of to verify anything at all. You can doubt every perception, every measurement, every theory, but the doubting itself is an experience. Awareness is the one fact you can't dodge, even when you try. That doesn't make awareness magical. It makes awareness foundational to the project of knowing anything. So what do you do with this tonight, in your actual life, not in a debate forum? You don't have to adopt cosmic beliefs. You can do something smaller and more practical. Notice how your mind manufactures reality. Notice how your anxiety is often a time machine, dragging you into a future that hasn't happened, then forcing your body to react as if it's already real. Notice how rumination is often a space machine, building a mental room where you replay scenes, stand in corners, imagine threats. If time and space are partly mental frameworks, then a lot of suffering is the mind locking you inside a simulation and calling it truth. Sleep science backs this in a very grounded way. Poor sleep amplifies threat detection, weakens emotional regulation, and makes the mind more likely to generate catastrophes that feel convincing. Your brain on low sleep is basically a rumor factory with a megaphone. And that's why the science behind the title matters. Your sense of reality, your sense of ending, your sense of doom. These are not purely philosophical. They're biological. They're modulated by sleep, stress, and attention. That's one of the hidden gifts of these ideas. They don't only challenge what you think the universe is, they challenge what you think you are. Not a helpless passenger being dragged toward an ending, but an observer whose attention has real power. Not supernatural power, but the power to shape experienced reality by selecting what becomes foreground, what becomes background, what becomes real enough to run your emotions. And that brings us to the simplest version of the conclusion. Bioentrism might be wrong in the grand cosmic claim, but it's probably right about one thing. Your lived universe is not just out there. It is co-authored by your mind. You carry space and time like lenses. You carry meaning like a filter. You carry reality like a story that updates every moment. So maybe the deepest question isn't, what happens when it ends? Maybe the deepest question is, are you actually seeing the world, or are you watching your mind's best guess of it? If this video shifted even one gear in your head, do me a favor, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because we're going deeper into consciousness, sleep, and the weird edges of physics in the next one. And I want one comment from you. Do you think consciousness is the product of the brain, or is the brain a filter that shapes something deeper? Write it in one sentence. I'll pin the sharpest takes.